Get your black ass out of my seat." Her hand, tipped with perfect nails, dug into his arm. A burning coffee cup pitched forward, scalded denim and spilled liquid. She shoved him aside and slid into seat 1A like she was claiming a throne. They say the cabin door closes for everyone, but not for moments like this. Phones rose, eyes locked. A woman in designer coat smiled at her coup. A black man stood in the aisle, ticket in hand, trembling but dignified. Have you ever felt your breath catch because someone else's injustice suddenly feels like it could be your own? What no one in that cabin, no flight attendant, no fellow passenger could have guessed in that split second was who Marcus Hamilton really was. And when the truth hit, everything froze. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Anthony Reynolds wasn't the kind of man who looked for trouble. He walked onto that flight with nothing more than a smudged boarding pass, a modest leather carry-on, and a calm demeanor that seemed to blend into the background. Seat 1A was his not just by the words printed on the paper, but by the very system Linda Prescott had grown used to bending in her favor. Linda Prescott, dressed in tailored white slacks and a silk scarf worth more than most paychecks, didn't see Anthony as a paying passenger that day. She saw him as an inconvenience. She shoved him with manicured authority, claimed his seat, and smirked as the first-class curtain swayed shut. Jessica Turner, the flight attendant on duty, walked forward with the grace of loyalty, not to the truth but to power. And in that moment, every eye on that plane waited to see if anyone would stand for Anthony Reynolds. But what unfolded inside that cramped cabin wasn't just another uncomfortable scene of arrogance versus humility. It became a moment that would ignite nationwide outrage. Because when Jessica Turner, the uniformed keeper of order, glanced at the boarding passes, her hands shook, but not because of a mismatch. She chose Linda's side, ignoring Anthony's proof, as though wealth itself carried more weight than ink on paper. Why did no one believe Anthony when the truth sat right there in black and white? How could one boarding pass turn into a symbol of something so much larger, something that echoed from smartphones into every corner of America? And when Linda Prescott's confident smirk suddenly faded into a look of raw terror, what had she seen that made her freeze before the very man she had mocked? Anthony Reynolds was not a man who cared for extravagance. He built his reputation in quiet conference rooms where his calm voice often settled storms that money alone could not solve. As a black executive in an industry still dominated by faces that didn't look like his, Anthony had learned early that dignity could speak louder than appearances. He preferred muted suits over designer labels, black coffee over champagne, silence over boastful laughter. On the morning of that flight, his phone buzzed with text messages from his wife, reminders to eat before the board meeting, a quick photo of his daughter's science project, and a final heart emoji meant to carry him through the chaos of travel. To Anthony, seat 1A wasn't luxury. It was preparation. It was a rare space to breathe, review his notes, and gather his thoughts before facing another day of decisions that carried weight far beyond himself. Linda Prescott lived in a different universe entirely. Her life was measured by loyalty points, the weight of branded luggage, and the flash of her boarding pass in front of lesser travelers. She was the kind of passenger flight crews remembered demanding, sharp-tongued and proudly aware that she could have anyone's job with a single call to customer service. For Linda, flying first class was not about convenience. It was a performance. Every glass of champagne, every approving nod from the crew, was part of a stage where she remained the star. Her Instagram glittered with snapshots of jet bridges, lounge meals, and luxury resorts tagged with captions about hard-earned relaxation. But beneath that gloss, Linda Prescott thrived on control, on bending situations until they broke in her favor. That day, when she saw Anthony Reynolds standing near her favorite seat, she didn't see an equal. She saw an obstacle, a man who, in her mind, didn't belong in her aisle. And then there was Jessica Turner, a woman caught between service and silence. She had worked the skies for nearly a decade, priding herself on discipline, punctuality, and maintaining order above all else. Jessica knew the unwritten rules of the cabin, the subtle hierarchy that meant appeasing high-status passengers at all costs. To her, Anthony Reynolds looked ordinary: plain sweater, scuffed shoes, a boarding pass she barely read before glancing at Linda's designer tote and polished smile. Jessica Turner was not cruel by nature, but she was conditioned by years of pressure, years of knowing who got the benefit of the doubt. Fairness in her world often yielded to appearances, and when the confrontation over seat 1A unfolded, Jessica believed she was keeping peace. Yet in reality, she was choosing a side, turning her back on justice in the name of order. This was not a fight over a seat. It was a fight over perception and power. Anthony carried with him the invisible weight of every slight endured, every assumption made by strangers who mistook humility for weakness. Linda, with her polished veneer, carried entitlement sharpened by years of unchecked privilege. And Jessica Turner, standing in the middle, represented something more complicated. The system itself, flawed not by intention but by the endless repetition of bias disguised as professionalism. As Anthony sat quietly in the waiting area that morning, meditating for 5 minutes before boarding, he had no idea that his calm presence would soon clash with Linda's hunger for dominance, or that Jessica's decision would echo beyond that cabin. What began as a quiet journey was about to become a mirror held up to the world. Anthony Reynolds had only spoken once calmly, firmly, when he told Linda Prescott that seat 1A was his. His voice carried no anger, only certainty. Linda's response was a smirk, and a cold sip of champagne poured before the plane even left the gate. She crossed her legs, leaned back, and with a casual flick of her hand signaled Jessica Turner. Jessica glanced at Anthony's boarding pass, then at Linda's designer scarf, and the decision was made before the ink was even read. "Sir, you'll need to step aside," Jessica said. Anthony stood motionless, his ticket still trembling in his fingers. The air thickened as whispers rose from the rows behind. And then the sound of a chime, the unmistakable click of smartphones recording. One by one, passengers lifted their cameras, capturing the collision of arrogance, silence, and humiliation that unfolded in real time. And TikTok was already watching. Within minutes, thousands of eyes followed the confrontation through shaky live streams. Anthony's quiet insistence was replayed with captions that ranged from disbelief to outrage. Linda adjusted her sunglasses as though she were unbothered by the attention. Jessica called for backup, and soon 2 more attendants appeared, each scanning the scene and then nodding in unison with Linda's version of events. Not one uniform bent down to inspect the name, the number, or the smudge on Anthony's boarding pass. Instead, they spoke to him in hushed, practiced tones, warning of delays, invoking protocol, and suggesting that the easiest thing to do was to walk away. To Anthony, it wasn't just about a seat. It was about truth, dignity, and the quiet decision to stand tall even when the ground beneath him was being pulled away. As the standoff stretched into long, unbearable minutes, the whispers inside the cabin turned into murmurs of unease. Some passengers exchanged looks but said nothing. Others muttered under their breath, more concerned about making their connections than confronting injustice happening right before them. Linda Prescott thrived on their silence. She lifted her phone, snapped a photo of her champagne, and typed a caption no one would see until later. Another day, another flight. To her, the drama was nothing more than a minor inconvenience, one she expected the airline to resolve in her favor. But Anthony's stillness, his refusal to yield, unsettled even her. For the first time, Linda felt the edge of her entitlement tremble, though she masked it behind her polished smile. The flight attendants, emboldened by their numbers, leaned closer to Anthony, voices sharper now. "If you don't comply, we'll have to call airport security," Jessica Turner said, her words carrying the finality of a threat rather than a solution. Anthony held out his ticket once more, steady this time, as though daring them to look. The camera lenses zoomed in, passengers shifting for better angles, whispers spreading like wildfire. Yet still, no one in uniform acknowledged the paper in his hand. The evidence of truth was ignored, suspended in the aisle for all to see. Narrator's voice cuts through. Every phone captured the same injustice, but still, no one in uniform looked at his ticket. And as the tension reached its peak, a ripple of anticipation ran through the cabin. Security was on its way, and when security arrived, the truth everyone ignored could no longer be hidden. When airport security boarded the plane, the cabin fell silent. The murmurs, the whispers, the clicking cameras, all of it dimmed into a single tense hush. 4 officers stood in the aisle, their eyes flicking between Linda Prescott reclining smugly in seat 1A and Anthony Reynolds, who still held his boarding pass firmly between his fingers. The lead officer didn't ask for Linda's name. He didn't even glance at her ticket. Instead, he turned to Anthony, his voice heavy with suspicion. "Sir, we've been told you're trying to sit in a seat that isn't yours." Anthony didn't argue. He extended the boarding pass, calm, steady. But the officer's brows furrowed as if the words printed on the paper couldn't possibly be trusted. Around them, passengers began to whisper the question that echoed in the minds of millions watching later. Why won't they just check? The silence broke with the sound of phones buzzing. TikTok streams flooded with comments, anger, disbelief, outrage, screens filled with hashtags, and by the time the plane's wheels touched tarmac again, one had already begun to trend. Delta discrimination. Social media didn't just capture the moment, it transformed it into something larger, something the airline could not contain. Thousands of strangers, many halfway across the world, now stood with Anthony Reynolds in that narrow aisle, demanding answers, demanding accountability. For Linda Prescott, the smirk she once wore began to slip as the glow of attention turned harsh. For Jessica Turner, her polished authority shrank under the weight of scrutiny. The cabin had become a courtroom, and the passengers silent until now were unwilling jurors. News traveled fast. Cable networks aired the shaky footage, anchors leaning forward as if to feel the outrage themselves. Headlines blared, "Black executive denied seat despite valid ticket." First-class confrontation sparks airline scandal. Interviews with passengers, reenacted in sharp detail, revealed the same disbelief. All they had to do was look at the ticket. Another voice. It wasn't about a seat, it was about respect. Linda Prescott's name began circulating on forums, her wealth and entitlement dissected by strangers who saw in her every entitled traveler who had ever cut the line, every arrogant smirk that had ever gone unchallenged. Jessica Turner's professionalism was questioned, her actions replayed in slow motion, dissected frame by frame, and Anthony Reynolds, calm, composed, dignified, became the center of a storm he never asked for, a storm that was rewriting the narrative of the flight, and perhaps something far greater. Narrator cuts in with precision. This wasn't just a seat dispute, it was becoming a national flashpoint for justice, dignity, and race. The images of Anthony standing in the aisle with his smudged boarding pass in hand now symbolized more than a travel inconvenience. It symbolized the imbalance of power, the quiet bias that played out daily in ways rarely caught on camera. But what none of the passengers, not even Linda herself, understood yet was that Anthony Reynolds was not just another passenger caught in the chaos of injustice. He carried with him a secret powerful enough to shatter the narrative in one tap of his screen. Anthony Reynolds had remained calm through every insult, every shove, every accusation. But as security hovered inches from his arm and the murmurs of passengers filled the cabin, he finally reached into his pocket not for more evidence on paper, but for something far harder to dismiss. He unlocked his phone with a slow, deliberate motion, the kind that drew every eye in the cabin. One swipe, one tap, and the screen glowed with a portal no ordinary passenger would ever see. At the top, bold letters spelled out a name: Anthony Reynolds, Chief Executive Officer, Delta Airlines. He held the phone out, not with anger, but with quiet certainty, letting the truth rest in the open. The officers who had been poised to remove him stepped back instantly, their rigid posture collapsing into unease. For the first time, the plane fell into absolute silence. It was as if the cabin itself had shifted. The uniformed attendants who had dismissed him froze, their polished authority unraveling with every second they avoided his gaze. Jessica Turner's lips parted as though to speak, but no words came. Her training, her certainty, all of it shattered in that instant. And then there was Linda Prescott. The confidence, the entitlement, the smug tilt of her chin gone. Her face drained of color as her eyes locked on the glowing screen in Anthony's hand. In her silence, she replayed every shove, every word, every humiliating gesture. For the first time, she realized not just who she had disrespected, but the weight of the power she had mocked. Anthony wasn't just another passenger. He was the very man whose name was etched into the foundation of the airline itself. In that instant, the balance of power flipped. The man they dismissed as an imposter was the owner of the very airline they served. And with that revelation, the story shifted from confrontation to reckoning. Cameras zoomed closer, passengers gasped audibly. TikTok comments exploded with disbelief. "Is this real?" one caption screamed. "She messed with the CEO," another blared. What had begun as a humiliation in silence now transformed into a spectacle of justice, recorded from every angle. Linda Prescott sat frozen in her stolen seat, unable to move, her fingers clutching the armrest as if it could anchor her against the storm of shame now closing in. Around her, the same passengers who once stayed quiet now stared openly, judgment in their eyes. And for the first time, Linda had no audience applauding her performance. Anthony Reynolds did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. As the weight of silence pressed on the cabin, he lowered his phone, looked directly at the attendants, and spoke with a calm that carried more force than shouting ever could. "You didn't make a mistake," he said evenly. "You made assumptions, dangerous ones." The words sliced through the air, sharper than any reprimand. For the first time, Jessica Turner lowered her gaze. The other attendants shifted uncomfortably, the uniforms that once gave them authority now feeling like shackles. Even the officers who had stood ready to remove Anthony remained rooted to the floor, confronted by a truth they could no longer deny. Every passenger knew it too. What had unfolded wasn't an error in procedure. It was a choice, and Anthony Reynolds had just named it with unshakable clarity. The cabin erupted not in chaos, but in applause. Passengers who had sat frozen moments before now rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, and recording every second. Phones trembled in hands as voices shouted words of support. "That's right. Tell them. Respect the man." For Linda Prescott, the moment of reckoning arrived in the glare of hundreds of lenses. Her stolen seat was no longer a prize, but a mark of shame. Slowly, reluctantly, she stood, her shoulders stiff as she tried to salvage dignity that had already slipped through her fingers. Without a word, she stepped aside, her head bowed not in humility but in defeat. The seat she once claimed with arrogance was returned, not by choice, but by justice itself. Anthony Reynolds walked toward seat 1A with deliberate steps. He paused at the edge of the aisle, his hand resting briefly on the headrest as every camera waited for his next move. His voice, measured yet commanding, carried through the cabin. "Respect is not earned by appearances. It is owed to every human being." The sentence struck harder than the revelation of his title. It was not about him being CEO. It was about the principle that had been trampled in front of everyone's eyes. Anthony sat down, finally claiming the space that was his all along, but the lesson he left behind hung heavier than any applause. He had turned humiliation into a teaching moment, one that would ripple far beyond that single flight. What began as humiliation became a lesson in dignity, one witnessed by millions worldwide. In the days that followed, hashtags trended without pause. Delta discrimination, respect in the air, Anthony Reynolds. News anchors debated the meaning of the incident. Analysts dissected every second of the footage, and social media lit up with ordinary voices reflecting on what they had seen. A father wrote, "I showed this to my son. This is how you fight back with calm strength." A woman posted, It wasn't about first class. It was about humanity. For Linda Prescott, silence became her only refuge. For Jessica Turner, the fallout reshaped her understanding of fairness. And for Anthony Reynolds, his quiet dignity had turned a stolen seat into a global stage for justice. This was never about a seat. It was never about first-class loyalty programs or who looked the part of a premium passenger. It was about something deeper: justice, prejudice, and the undeniable power of truth. On that plane, Anthony Reynolds reminded the world that dignity cannot be stolen, even when appearances are used as weapons. His quiet strength turned humiliation into a message that echoed far beyond the walls of that aircraft. Linda Prescott walked away shamed. Jessica Turner and her colleagues were forced to confront the danger of assumptions, and every passenger carried with them a story they would never forget. But the question lingers: if you had been there, what would you have done? Would you have spoken up when Anthony's boarding pass was dismissed without a glance? Or would you have stayed silent, like so many others, waiting for someone else to act? Because in moments like these, silence itself can become a choice, one that either protects injustice or challenges it. The cameras captured the truth, but justice only found its voice when courage finally met calm defiance. And if you thought this was shocking, wait until you hear about the billionaire maid who turned the tables on her boss. A story where power and loyalty collide in ways no one could have imagined. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next twist in our journey through real stories that will leave you speechless.